समुद्रस्य हिमाद्रश्चैव दक्षिणं वर्षं तद् भारतं नाम भारतीयत्र सन्तति।
Namaste. Welcome to this episode of Itihasa. This episode of Itihasa is a continuation of the last episode. We are exploring the notion of Bharatvarsha, what it means to be Bharatiya. In this particular episode, we will focus on the geography. In particular, the mountains and the rivers. Bharatvarsha is part of Jambudvipa, and each Varsha was defined in terms of mountains, in terms of rivers. Mountains or mountain ranges is a more accurate description, and rivers.
Jagadisha Sudesha Bharesha Vibho
विचार, दर्शन और परंपरा का उदात्त रूप भारतीय संस्कृति, जहां हजारों लाखों वर्षों से लोगों के जीवन को संवारती रही है, वो भूखंड भारत का भूगोल है। भूगोल और संस्कृति के बीच एक घनिष्ठ संबंध है। संसार का मानचित्र देखें तो भारत का भूगोल अन्य देशों से काफी अलग और अनोखा है।
भारतम महाभारतम।
प्रकृति ने शुरू से ही इसकी सीमाओं को अगाध जल राशि वाले समुद्र और वृहद पर्वतीय श्रृंखलाओं से भरपूर बनाया है। प्राचीन भारत की भौगोलिक सीमाओं की बात करें तो बृहत्तर भारत की अवधारणा सामने आती है। बृहत्तर भारत का विस्तार पूरब में प्राग ज्योतिष यानी असम से लेकर पश्चिम में ईरान तक और दक्षिण में कन्याकुमारी से लेकर उत्तर में तुर्किस्तान तक माना जाता है। इतने विशाल भूभाग में आज भी भारतीय संस्कृति और सभ्यता के प्रमाण मिल जाते हैं। वेद पुराणों में भारतवर्ष की नदियों, पर्वतों और प्रांतों के वर्णन को देखकर समग्र भारतवर्ष के भौगोलिक स्थिति का पता चलता है। उत्तर में हिमालय से लेकर दक्षिण के सह्याद्री, मलय, नीलगिरी, मध्य के विंध्य, श्रीशैल आदि पर्वतों, सिंधु, सरस्वती, शतुद्री, बिपाशा, वितस्ता जैसी नदियों का वर्णन करके विशाल भारत की सांस्कृतिक एकता की संकल्पना की गई है। हालांकि अल्प ज्ञात तथ्य, विस्मृत साक्ष्य के आधार पर जब इतिहास गढ़ा गया तो भारत के अस्तित्व और भौगोलिक अवस्थिति को लेकर कुछ मिथक भी प्रचलित हुए। साल दर साल इन मिथकों को पश्चिमी इतिहासकारों ने अपने आधे अधूरे ज्ञान से बल प्रदान करके सत्य में परिवर्तित कर दिया। लेकिन उन क्षेत्रों, उन संस्कृतियों का क्या जिसकी बात वेद और पुराण करते हैं। वेदों में 7 नदियों की भूमि यानी सप्त सिंधु नामक क्षेत्र का उल्लेख है, जिसे ऋग्वेद का हृदय स्थल कहा गया है। वैसे तो लिखित रूप में ऐसे कोई विशेष जानकारी नहीं है कि कौन सी 7 नदियां इस क्षेत्र में बहती थीं, लेकिन कई मंत्रों में सरस्वती को 7 नदियों में से एक पवित्र नदी माना गया है। 7 नदियों में सरस्वती, सिंधु और 5 नदियों को शामिल किया गया। बात सरस्वती नदी की करें तो वेदों में संदर्भित सरस्वती नदी के वास्तविक प्रमाण और वैज्ञानिक साक्ष्य भी मिले हैं। ऋग्वेद में सरस्वती का उल्लेख 72 बार आता है और 3 स्रोत तो पूरी तरह से सरस्वती को ही समर्पित है। ऋग्वेद के नदी स्तुति सूक्त में अनंत, अखंड और प्रचंड वेग से गमन करने वाली सरस्वती नदी को यमुना के पश्चिम और सतलुज के पूर्व में बहते और पर्वतों से सागर तक पहुंचते हुए बताया गया है। तो इतिहास की इस कड़ी में हम बात करेंगे भारत के भूगोल की। जानेंगे कैसे आकार लिया भारत ने, कैसे प्रकृति ने भारत की सीमाओं को अभेद बनाया।
We are joined by the same guests. Namaste, Sanjeev.
Namaste.
Thank you for joining us once again. Namaste, Satish ji. Namaste, Krishnan ji. Namaste, Bharadwaj ji. Satish ji, Krishnan ji, Bharadwaj ji. There is a stotram mantram that people chant all the time, sometimes even daily. Gange cha yamune shaiva godavari saraswati narmade sindhu kaveri jale asmin sannidham kuru. Can we hear that from you?
Sure. Om Gange cha yamune chaiva godavari saraswati narmade sindhu kaveri जलेस्मिन् सन्निधिं कुरु। ओम।
जले अस्मिन् सन्निधं कुरु का मतलब क्या है? बाकी तो सभी लोग समझ गए
जी, यह प्रार्थना मंत्र है। प्रायः स्नान के समय में हो या किसी भी पूजन में, कलश में आवाहन के संदर्भ में हो, इस श्लोक को मंत्र के रूप में प्रयोग किया जाता है। ये गंगा यमुना गोदावरी सरस्वती नर्मदा सिंधु कावेरी, इन नदियों से प्रार्थना की जाती है, आप सभी आएं, अस्मिन् जले सन्निधिं कुरु, आप इस हमारे सामने जो जल है इसमें आपका सन्निधान प्रदान करें। इस प्रार्थना ही इसका ये तात्पर्य है।
Sanjeev, tell us a little bit about the geography. Tell us a little bit about the mountains first, and then we'll come to the rivers.
So what you have here is a geography of the Indian subcontinent. There's obviously the mountains, and we will hear a little bit more about it. But basically the rivers and the mountains define a sacred geography that is Bharatavarsha. Now, the point that he was making is that there are these 7 rivers, they are considered sacred, but it is very interesting that this river, these 7 rivers include the rivers of southern India as well. Now, it includes Kaveri, it includes Godavari, it has central India in the case of Narmada, and then of course the northern rivers of Ganga, Sindhu and so on. So this is important because this is a landscape that is also, as you heard in the first episode, south of the snowy mountains, i.e. the Himalayas, and north of the oceans. So again, that same Bharatvarsha geography is being reiterated, and as you mentioned, we will come to the mountains, but these mountains are important as well because they are also of that same geography. And if you ask them to chart them, you will again hear all the mountain ranges of the country as well.
So to step back a little bit, we have this concept of the Varshas, which are a subcontinent of the Deepas.
Yes.
And we have the concept of mountain ranges that separate one Varsha from another Varsha.
Yes.
And we have mountains within each Varsha.
Yes.
And we have rivers within each Varsha.
Yes.
Typically the number of mountains within each Varsha, not that it is very consistent, but typically the number of mountains within each Varsha, the Kolachal or the Kula Parvat, will be 7, and the number of rivers will also be 7. So can we hear this chant about the mountains?
Yes. Om Mahendro Malayas Sahyah Shuktiman Vriksha Parvataha Vindhyascha Pariyatrascha Saptaite Kula Parvataha Purvadeshadikaschaiva Kamarupa Nivasinaha Paunra Kalinga Magadhaha Dakshinatyascha Sarvashaha. इस श्लोक में सप्त माने 7 कुल पर्वतों का नाम गिनाए गए हैं।
कुल पर्वत, कुलाचल भी कभी-कभी
कुलाचल भी कहते हैं। महेंद्र, मलय, सह्य, शुक्तिमान, वृक्ष पर्वत, विंध्य और पारियात्र, इन 7 कुल पर्वतों के नाम गिनाए गए हैं।
When he said Mahendra Parvat, this is the eastern Ghats. The Malaya is the southern western Ghats of the Nilgiris. The Sahya, the Sahyadris, we now known as the Sahyadris, which is the northern western Ghats. The Riksha, the Satpuras. The Vindhyas, in traditionally, is the eastern Vindhyas. And the Pariyatra is the western Vindhyas. There is another range which is mentioned, which is called the Suktimat, and there is some dispute about which it is. My own guess, it is the Aravalis. So this is the 7 ranges. Now, if you happen to be from northeast, please don't feel left out of this, because while there isn't a northern range, because that is already counted in the Himalayas, it does say there are those who reside in the east, such as the inhabitants of Kamarupa, which is obviously Assam and the northeast generically. So this is again a geography which I mentioned, similar to the one that describes the subcontinent. The number 7, by the way, as you mentioned, is absolutely interesting here. Because this number 7, although the number itself remains constant, by the way, we use this as a sacred number for other things like the Saptarishi and so on. So this number 7...
7 horses of the sun.
Yes. So this number 7 is sacred. But as the idea of India spread, the 7 rivers that we were referring to actually changes. So perhaps what we can do is go back all the way to the Rig Veda and listen to what the 7 rivers were in the Rig Vedic time, which is very clearly described. First, not at the Sapta Sindhu, but simply the enumeration of the rivers that happens in the Nadistuti Suktam.
In any case, the word Sindhu means any body of water.
Yes.
Any river, it need not necessarily be the Indus or the Sindhu as we understand it today. Satish ji, Krishnan ji, Bharadwaj ji, can we hear these 2 chants?
Yes. Om imam me gange yamune saraswati shutudristomam sachata parushnya ashiknya marudvridhe वितस्तयार्जी किये शृणुह्या सुषोमया। ओम
का मतलब क्या है?
जी, यह मंत्र ऋग्वेद के 10वें मंडल से लिए गए हैं। 75वां सूक्त है, उसमें से 5वां मंत्र है। ये 9 नदियों का नाम है, मगर 7 को ही इन्होंने रिकॉग्नाइज किया है। गंगा, यमुना, सरस्वती, शुतुद्री, परुष्णी एंड मरुद्वृधा एंड अर्जिकिया। तो इनके साथ में असिकनी के साथ मरुद्वृधा कह रहे हैं, सुषोमा के साथ ये अर्जिकिया ये इस नदी का वो उल्लेख कर रहे हैं। तो इन नदियों को एक साथ यहाँ गिनाए गए हैं।
What are these rivers identified as today, to the extent we can do the identification?
So this is an interesting thing, because you heard in the Puranic 7 rivers, there is a mention of the Saraswati. Now, by the time the Puranic chants were done, the Saraswati had actually dried up. And we know that from the Mahabharata and
the geological evidence.
And the geological evidence. But it is still being mentioned. Why is it being mentioned in Puranic times? Because it is absolutely critical. It is the backbone of the understanding of an earlier period of Vedic literature. And so when you go back to the Vedic literature and look for the Saraswati River, which by the way, many European scholars keep saying mythical and so on. It's not the case. It's a very obviously a real river.
And even within the Rig Veda, the description of Saraswati changes.
Yes.
Between the earlier mandalas and the later ones.
Yes. So what happens here is, first of all, it enumerates all the rivers starting from the east to the west as understood by those who compose the Vedic literature. So it starts with Ganga, Yamuna, Saraswati, Shutudru, which is the Sutlej, and so on. So first thing it does, it clarifies where the Saraswati river is. It's not a mythical river, and is a river between the Yamuna and the Sutlej. Now, it happens to be that there is a dry riverbed of a big river there called the Ghaggar. Now, why is this interesting at all is that this was the homeland of the Bharata tribe by which we name ourselves. And the Bharatas, of course, mentioned that they lived along the banks of the Saraswati, which they incidentally also call the Bharati. It is so identified with them. Even today, when you do Saraswati Puja, you will say Bhagwati, Bharati, Devi, Namaste. Why? So you remember that the Bharata tribe lived along the Saraswati. Now, the Bharatas called their homeland the Sapta Sindhava, the land of the 7 rivers. So this is this number 7 keeps popping up. And now the question is, what is the exact contours of this 7 rivers? Which are those 7 rivers? Now we know one of them is Saraswati. Now, if you did some lazy scholarship, you will say, oh, 7 rivers of Punjab plus Sindhu, and you end up with the 7 rivers. This is not what is there in the texts, by the way. The interesting part is the Rig Veda itself does not mention the other rivers at all. It always mentions the Saraswati and other 6 rivers. It is very clear from the repetition that the Saraswati is the anchor of this, and really the other 6 rivers empty out into it. In other words, this is a river system. The Sapta Sindhu is a river system, and these are all the tributaries of the Saraswati itself. So we are really dealing with a relatively small area, roughly what is today Haryana, maybe a bit of northern Rajasthan, maybe a bit of eastern Punjab. That is basically what was the original homeland of the Bharatas. Now, this is also remembered, interestingly, in the Mahabharata, because Balram goes on a pilgrimage. As you know, he did not participate in the Kurukshetra war. He went on a pilgrimage along the Saraswati river, which had by this time largely dried up. So he goes along the dry riverbed from Gujarat upwards to the point called Vinashana, where the rivers disappear into the sands. And then he says that from here on there are these Sapta Saraswat rivers, which join together to form the Saraswati. And he then mentions all the 7 Saraswati, the tributaries, and you can hear that chant, and I will then explain what those 7 mean.
Before that, do you have any views on the Drishadvati? Because we keep hearing about the Drishadvati also.
Yes, so Drishadvati is also a dry river bed, which today we call the Chautang, which combined together which was a tributary of the Saraswati, and the land between the Drishadvati and the Saraswati is really the holy land and the Sapta Sindhu.
Saraswatai Drishadvattau Devanaddau Yadantaram Tang Devanirmitang Deshang Brahmavartang Prachakshate.
Absolutely.
Saraswati is a river etymologically which is full of pools. Drishadvati is a river which is full of rocks or pebbles. Can we, Satish ji, hear the chant, Balaram's travels that Sajeev mentioned?
Yes. Om Rajan Sapta Saraswatyah Yabhirvyaptamidam Jagat Ahuta Bhalavadbhirhi Tatra Tatra Saraswati Suprabha Kanchanakshi Cha Vishala Manasahrada Saraswati Oghavati Suvenurvimalodaka. Om.
क्या मतलब है?
जी, ये पूरा जगत 7 सरस्वतियों से व्याप्त है और अलग अलग प्रदेशों में महान लोग सरस्वती को आइडेंटिफाई करते हैं, जैसे सुप्रभा, कांचनाक्षी, विशाला, मानसा, सरस्वती, ओघवती, सुवेणु. विमलोदका एडजेक्टिव फॉर
क्लियर वाटर.
यस. तो इन 7 जगह को उन्होंने हाईलाइट किया, मगर अलग अलग जगह में अलग अलग प्रदेशों में सरस्वती को महान लोग आइडेंटिफाई करते हैं. ये इसका मतलब है.
Sanjeev, you were about to explain to us what this means.
So what is happening is, it brings you 2 things together. One is, it is identifying the 7 rivers that came together into the Saraswati. It does not tell us where these rivers are, but one thing is very, very clear, that this does not relate to the 5 rivers of Punjab and the Sindhu. All these streams are then mentioned in name, but we do not know where these rivers are except for one, which is the Ughavati, which we know flows through Kurukshetra. So at least one of these tributaries of the Saraswati, at least we know it used to flow past Kurukshetra. Now the others were perhaps also similar tributaries. Now what happens is, by the time the Mahabharata is being written, this river is clearly already drying up. So what is happening here is a sort of a transition phase when it is going from being a real river with all these streams coming together to becoming a much more metaphorical river, which represents the ancient Bharatas and their civilization. So you can clearly transition from this idea of a real river, and then it says this now comes to extend to other parts of the country, and then eventually the idea of the 7 rivers becomes the idea of the 7 rivers you heard in the very first chant when it became included the southern rivers and the central river.
One of the things that comes across from everything that you have said is that geography was defined very much by the river systems.
Absolutely.
Civilization was defined by the river systems, and India, of course, Bharatvarsha, of course, is a country that's rich in many rivers. But historically, that civilization, urbanization, or whatever else, it happened along the course of the rivers, particularly when it became settled agriculture and urbanization. How did this concept of Bharatvarsha, the geographical notion, change over time? Let us talk, for example, about Adi Shankaracharya and his travels, which covered a certain part of Bharatvarsha as we understand it today. So please explain that to us.
So as I mentioned, you start with a landscape which is relatively limited, the idea of 7 rivers. Now it expands as the civilization spread. And as I mentioned right in the first episode, certainly by the 3rd century BC, the southern tip of India had clearly conceptualized itself as part of the Indian civilizations. Very likely it happened well before that, but we have definite evidence of it by the time the Tolpakiam was composed. Now what happens is that this conception of a sacred geography is being reiterated over and over again in subsequent centuries. One example of that is, of course, Shankaracharya's yatras across the country. Now, if you plot them across on a map, you will say they're not random movement of a person. He goes all the way to the north, he goes all the way to the east, he goes to the west, he's of course from the south. So he's traveling a certain landscape. And then, of course, he establishes 4 mathas. Now, they are not arbitrary distribution. One is in the north, one is in the west, one is in the east, one is in the south. So, again, it's not an arbitrary distribution. So, what is happening is that at every stage, there is a reiteration of Bharatvarsha, a certain civilizational idea, but also a geographical idea that is anchored in it. Now, of course, the idea of dharmic civilization spreads outside of this core area. It spreads to Southeast Asia, it spreads to Central Asia, and to other places as well. And here too, it's quite interesting what happens. The southern India and coastal India was more than aware of Southeast Asia, a people who they referred to as the Naga people. In fact, they themselves refer to themselves as Naga or serpent people. But it's very curious that in our texts, we never refer to these people as being barbarians or mlechas, because very clearly, by a very early stage, even Southeast Asian people were considered within the civilization and therefore not mlechas, i.e. barbarians. So it is quite interesting that this conception grows further and further. But certainly, even through all this original idea of a sacred geography, which is within the subcontinent, remains anchored. And of course, as I mentioned, Shankaracharya then sets these 4 mathas in 4 corners of the sacred land.
Obviously, this evolved over time. This entire series is called Itihasa, which typically means the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and the Puranas.
Yes.
And the Puranas, of course, the different 18 Mahapuranas were composed at different points in time. So there's a space timeline of some 1,000 years between the earliest and the latest one, or perhaps less, 700, 800 years. You have spoken about in your lecture about the Shakti Pithas. The Shakti Pithas are connected with the story that everyone is familiar with about Sati giving up her life at Daksha's sacrifice, and once the dead body had been sliced up by Vishnu, these descending in different parts. The Pithas, of course, have evolved over time, perhaps 4 originally, then 18 in Adi Shankaracharya's Stotrams, then 50 or 51, and even 108. So tell us a little bit about the Shakti Pithas.
So for doing that, you have to go back to the original contract of the Rig Veda. So as we heard, once the Bharata tribe had compiled the Vedic literature, they come to this contract where they all agree that all the gods have a place around the sacrificial fire. However, look at what happens in Daksha's Yajna. In Daksha's Yajna, one god is left out, which is Shiva. So this is a violation of the original Rigvedic contract. A god is not being given his rightful anointed place around the fire. So in this, doing this, he has violated the original Vedic compact, and Sati quite correctly therefore declares that this is no longer a valid yajna, and she violates it physically by dying and in fact sacrificing herself into the fire. Now, not only is she sacrificing herself and violating the yajna, what now happens is that, of course, Shiva is enraged by all of this, and he says, I will now completely destroy the universe. Or maybe you can say now Vedic civilization will be destroyed as a result of this. So he lifts her body and is going to destroy the universe when Vishnu turns up and cuts her body up. And then this body is then scattered across this sacred geography. And it is quite interesting. In doing so, she is almost physically uniting the sacred geography from a divisive idea where one of the gods was not allowed a space along the fire, to one of physically uniting all of it. And again, just like with Shankaracharya, this is not an arbitrary distribution. It of course evolved, as you said, but it came to have a certain geography. So look at where all these are. The easternmost of the Shakti Pithas is where? In Tripura, Tripura Sundari. Westernmost, Hinglaj Mata in Balochistan. Northernmost, Sharda Mata, which is now in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. And the southernmost is in Kumari or Kanyakumari, in the southern tip of India. So again, the same idea of a geography united, just like with the rivers, with the mountains. This idea of Bharatiyata or Bharatvarsha is clearly defines a certain geography and a certain civilization, which is very much about allowing for a concept of assimilation as opposed to domination.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Itihasa, where we learnt about Bharatvarsha's geography. Sanjeev Sanyal, thank you for joining us. Satish ji, Krishnan ji, Bharadwaj ji, thank you for taking the trouble, joining us all the way from Chennai. Please join us in the next episode of Itihasa, only on Sangsad TV. Loosely we hear the word, the expression, yogini. In the next episode of Itihasa, we will learn about yoginis. We will learn about the 64 yogini temples in India. I will be in conversation with Veena Unnikrishnan, who has traversed this entire yogini circuit. She has also herself painted wonderful paintings of the 64 yoginis. Keep watching Itihasa on Sangsad TV.
उत्तरं यत् समुद्रस्य हिमाद्रश्चैव दक्षिणं वर्षं तद् भारतं नाम भारतीय त्रिसन्ततिः